Now, we're about to start the conversation about the second of the knowledge development projects by Knoca that are being presented today. Now, just briefly, the knowledge development projects are about curating new knowledge that's relevant for climate assemblies. And the one we're going to hear about now is about remits, which is a word that I think we would start by explaining for those who don't know it. I didn't know it until I started to work with these things. And to guide us through today, the head of this knowledge development project, Stephanie Brancaforte, forgive me if I'm not good at pronouncing this very beautiful French name, will lead us. And then we have another good name, this one German, Janosch Pfeffer, who has been a part of the project too, will guide us through a presentation. Now, I will ask you to introduce yourselves, to introduce what a remit is and what work you've done. And once you have done your presentation, Frederick will take over to guide us through a panel discussion and a Q&A. So, Stephanie and Janosch, I haven't introduced you, so please go ahead and say who you are and take the floor. So, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm Stephanie Brancaforte, actually more Italian than French, and I've been working with Janosch Pfeffer, who can introduce himself a bit better. My day job is that I work at change.org, and I also am at Rinascimento Green, which has done some assemblies in Italy. So I wanted to just start by saying thank you so much for everyone here and to Knoca for these very fruitful and inspiring collaborations. And also to the more than 40 people who contributed to our research in one way or another, and to Graham Smith, of course, for his incredible support in bringing this project to life. So yes, for clarity, let's start by defining a remit. A remit for a climate assembly refers to the specific question or questions that the mini public or the members are being asked to consider. Nicole Hunter of Mosaic Lab captures it very nicely. As organizers, we weave the remit through everything and come up with structures that help answer the question. It's our anchor for the entire deliberation. So we oriented our work around key questions that commissioners, whoever they may be, should ask themselves when setting a remit. Oh yeah, thanks, the slides. Why run the assembly? What kinds of principles should they keep in mind while setting the remit? Who should be involved in setting the remit, and how might the remit be delivered? In particular, whether sub-themes and work streams should be introduced to enable the assembly to cover more ground. As other presenters have already mentioned...
Excuse me, we can only see the presenter's mode. Can you maybe switch to full screen, please? Sorry.
Thank you, Ines.
Thank you.
Better? Okay, perfect. Collaboration, always important. As other presenters have already mentioned, several crucial decisions about the remit have profound downstream impacts for the assembly design and ultimately on how the assembly outcomes are formulated and received, and indeed how they influence policy. This may seem very obvious, but context is important, and each assembly is different. The remit should be tailored to reaching the objective set out for the assembly. Climate Assembly's overarching function, as we know, tends to be to influence climate policy, typically in the problem identification and policy formulation phase of a classic policy cycle, though they can also be used to scrutinize and evaluate proposals. But that's not the only answer. So let's turn to the first question. Why are we running the assembly? There are several buckets of answers. Renewing democracy by giving more power to citizens on issues of societal concern. Increasing policymakers' knowledge and certainty by providing ideas and insights on what actions citizens are willing to take. Enabling ambitious climate action by persuading or countering the power of critics and lobbyists in the political sphere. And influencing public attitudes and behaviors. And finally, challenging the system, so disrupting entrenched attitudes and practices by challenging current policies and elevating marginalized agendas. Commissioners should also think about the outputs they're hoping for. Let's get concrete. And we explore the implications for several types of outputs, namely an overarching direction-setting agenda or platform for climate action, coming up with focused proposals on specific climate policies, or, as I said, evaluation of policy options, scenarios, or scrutiny of proposals. It's important for the commissioners to surface their assumptions and agree on a common objective based on a shared understanding of the problem. These can be revisited along the way as decisions are made throughout the process. But without sharing an objective, it's very difficult to agree on a remit. And with that, I hand over to Janosch.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie. You were very quick there in the beginning. I mean, we only have 10 minutes, so I was a little behind with the presentation. But thanks, everyone, and hi. I'm Janosch. I'm a PhD student at Leuphana University in Lüneburg in Germany, and work mostly on mini-publics. So let me head on. So once this groundwork is laid, where we have kind of found a common objective, which is harder than it looks or sounds, we can move on to actually setting the remit. And so the question I was concerned with mostly is, what should we really keep in mind when setting a remit? So I talked to several experienced and inspirational people from the network and developed guiding principles for setting a remit. And you can see them here. They're best understood as kind of a checklist of factors to consider. And it's both about what to avoid, but also about what works well. So suppose you have several ideas on the table. This output is meant to help you in answering whether the issue on the table is a good one for a citizens' assembly or rather not. And we don't have time to go into detail now, but if you're interested in this, there's a very short paper just on these guiding principles on the Knoca website. And yeah, go and check it out. But it's not all about what to consider. Another question is who to consider when setting the remit. And Erwin brought this up earlier today. So who should be involved in setting the remit? And I mean, different options are possible. And I'm just going to list some of the people or some of the typical actors quickly. So you could involve mostly policymakers and civil servants. What about citizens, the participants themselves or the broader public, scientists and policy experts, stakeholders and interest groups, participation experts, or all of them, the more the better. So in brief, all of those actors can contribute knowledge that's really quite relevant for setting the remit. And involving many of the different actors in remit decisions will likely increase the quality and also the legitimacy of the process, but will also take more time and nerves, for sure. So in our report, for each of these actors on the slide, we lay out some advantages for, but also risks of giving them major control over the remit. And just to give you an example, policymakers will most likely have in-depth knowledge about the policy process, about what is timely, about where the core conflicts lie in the policy system and so on. But they might also be interested in stuff that citizens find super boring. For example, Professor David Farrell recently criticized the Irish government for convening citizens' assemblies on issues like the way referendums are held. So yeah, go and check it out in the report if you want to know more about that. And I hand back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Janosch. And now we'll move on to the questions around delivering the remit. And indeed, we're giving you a very skeleton version here, and we hope that you'll go back and look at the paper. And indeed, we welcome continued feedback. I'm sure we didn't do justice to the 40+ people who helped us out and gave us their opinions. So the design of the assembly should ensure that members address the remit, of course, and are able to produce that, the outputs that the commissioners are looking for. When a broad remit is set, organizers often decide to focus on several sub-questions or themes. So which ones should they choose? Assemblies can deal with a broad range of themes. Indeed, it seems as though nothing is really too technical, provided that the proper sort of information groundwork is laid. Can't deal with all of them at the same time. Previous assemblies have divided up the work in myriad ways, and the approaches can include the following, and it can also be a mix and match of these. Members focusing on decarbonizing the most carbon-intensive sectors, such as electricity, heating, etc. Members focusing on the systems to which they feel most connected, or the issues to which they feel most connected, or that are the most relevant to people's lives. So thinking about education, consumption, energy poverty. Members focusing on overarching moral principles that should guide decision making, such as different notions of justice or expanding moral considerations, can be focused on adaptation, on restoration, etc. So who then, to repeat the question in a different way, how much control should commissioners give citizens to set the agenda within the sub-themes? The sub-themes can be set in advance by the commissioners. Commissioners can make a proposal that assembly members can modify, or the assembly members can be given total freedom to propose and explore themes. And all of these have been tried in various assemblies. In the Danish case, which is quite interesting and which some here can describe in much greater detail than I, there were two iterations of the Climate Assembly. In the first, members learned about climate impacts and key issues in mitigation and adaptation, and then chose which issues to work on in more depth through a structured process. There was a lot of top-down input, and the members' feedback was that they wanted more freedom to define the issues. In the second iteration, members were given freedom to respond to the broad remit as they saw fit, and so it reflected the members' priorities better, but the themes may not have been formulated in a way that were as relevant for policymakers. So in some, giving assembly members more power over setting the agenda has its advantages, namely ownership in particular. But if members are given control, past experience suggests that they should be supported with input from experts about the implications of choosing and formulating different options. It can be quite a lot of work, and it needs to be well prepared. So should one split into subgroups at all? As has been mentioned also in other talks, splitting up the assembly allows the assembly to cover much more ground, but can also reduce the legitimacy and robustness of the results if only a subsection of the members have participated in any given theme and giving their inputs, and they don't necessarily have as much experience and exposure to certain topics. They may not feel as much ownership over the proposals. However, there are various options for learning across subgroups that can counteract these downsides. One option would be that members are separated into groups to dive into their subtopic, and then afterwards have space before final voting or evaluation to present their proposed outputs to the entire assembly and gain feedback and possibly optimize or adapt the results. Another option is that members are able to visit other groups during the deliberations to cross-pollinate ideas, or that members rotate to new topics, or that some rotate while some stay behind to sort of anchor the topic, or that members have access to others' proposals and can collaborate, for instance, in shared documents to make and vote on amendments. There is much more that we could say, but this is where the journey specifically on remits ends for now. You can see more on the Knoca website, and there's still time, as I say, for us to integrate feedback. And soon there will be another guidance document on how best to support members with the knowledge and perspectives they need to produce high quality outputs, so more on the knowledge sharing side of it. So thank you to Janosch, to our kind panelists, and to the organizers, and to all of you. And Frederick, back to you.
Yeah, I just had problems finding my mouse, but now it's there. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Stephanie and Janosch, for these interesting insights and for all your hard work. Let's dive directly into it. So we've gathered a panel to discuss and reflect on your insights. And these people we've gathered 3 people. So the first one is Ines Omann, who's the coordinator of the Australian Climate Assembly. She was previously a senior researcher.
No, please, Austrian. Sorry.
Austrian,
not
what did I say?
Australian.
Sorry, Austrian,
Sorry,
I meant Austrian.
this is really a misunderstanding.
Yeah, Austrian, I meant Austrian. And you were previously a senior researcher dealing with the sustainability transitions, scenario development, transdisciplinary research, and sustainability in general. And with us, we also have Andrea Tilche. Is that correctly pronounced? Who's
more or less.
More or less, okay, perfect. Who's an expert for the Italian Ministry of Sustainable Infrastructure and Mobility and a professor at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And then we have Justin Kenrick, who is an anthropologist and activist from Edinburgh, and he's a member of Extinction Rebellion Scotland and works in the Forest People program. So welcome the three of you, and thank you for taking your time to participating today. So to start off this panel discussion, I wanted.
Sorry,
Yeah.
just for 1 second. I noticed that the chat is disabled, and I was wondering if we wanted to enable that so people could ask questions and make comments.
It's disabled?
I see chat disabled. Maybe it's just for me.
Maybe one of my colleagues could take a look at that. I don't think it's disabled for me. But let's get back to that if it's still a problem.
I can see the chat. It's disabled for us too.
Okay. I think I'll let my colleagues take a look at it, and then we'll see if we can figure it all out. Okay, I can see people writing, so I guess it's solved. All right, perfect, thank you. But I was wondering, one of the things that you've mentioned, Stephanie and Janosch, was the process of how you actually formulate this type of remit. So there are different possibilities. You could involve different type of people, and I guess it also depends on who's actually commissioning the Climate Assembly. So I was just wondering, earlier today, we heard that in the Scottish case, they had the stewarding group who spent some time on making this remit. And I think that maybe, Justin, you were involved in this process?
Yeah, shall I respond to that, Frederick?
Yes, please.
Okay, so yes, I was involved for Extinction Rebellion. Two of us were on the stewarding group, which was deciding on the frame for the assembly. But of course, before that, you got to wonder why the assembly happened in the first place. And I suggest that these assemblies happen for two reasons. One is to contain change, and the other is to enable change. And I'm just being very crude about it because we've got brief time. But so there was a big push. It didn't come because it was handed down by policymakers or by people from above. It happened because of a push from the ground, Extinction Rebellion, and lots of others in Scotland pushing for this to happen. So it emerged from the ground. So when you're asking who commissioned this, I'd say it was commissioned by the people. On the other hand, the civil servants who were responsible for kind of controlling the process going forward would say it was commissioned by the government and by legislation that went through. And technically they're right, but that legislation wouldn't have gone through without the push from the ground. So in all of this, it's important to remember, where is agency? Where is the commissioning authority? Who is really doing this and why? And I'd suggest that in the stewarding group that we had that was deciding on the remit, and I found your paper really helpful, by the way. Anyway, leave that aside. The stewarding group that was framing that was kind of handpicked by the civil servants. And so though there were two of us from Extinction Rebellion there, we weren't the people they wanted. They chose other people from Extinction Rebellion, and then amongst us, we decided who, but everybody else was handpicked. So it was a very handpicked group of people who appear on lots of other kind of stewarding groups for the Scottish government, and they're for a safe people. I mean, they're all very nice people, including people I politically disagree with, but they're safe pairs of hands. And I guess what I suggest is the need is to have a really clear tension between those who are seeing the need to not rock the boat, and that's understandable, and those who see the need for radical change. And so rather than pushing one extreme or the other, the need is to include both of those in a process that is very much government and civil society led, where you have a process which is really clear about including those points of view, the whole range of points of view. So you're not pushing an agenda, and we weren't pushing an agenda. We weren't pushing 2025, for example. We were saying, let's leave it to the citizens, hearing this whole range on the way through. I could go on, I could stop. What would you like? I could go on forever, but.
Cool. Thank you, Justin. Maybe I'd like to give the word to Ines and ask, what did you do in the Austrian case, and how did you think it worked?
How do you mean, what did I do? I can talk 2 hours. What we did? Can you focus a bit more?
What type of process did you go through to decide on the remit? Was it more like a bottom-up approach or a top-down?
No, it was a top-down approach. Yeah, in Austria we had the case that I mean both actually, because we first had the Klimavolksbegehren. This was an instrument, a political one. I think it doesn't exist in this Volksbegehren in many countries. It's not a public decision, but it's asking the public whether they would support a certain topic that is brought in by civil society. In our case, it was the climate survey, so to say, where the people behind it required different things. One was more public participation in climate policy. This was then discussed in the parliament for 3 times, and the result was that the parliament asked the government, in particular the Ministry for Climate Action, to set up a national climate citizen assembly with the aim to develop policy measures that I can talk about it, to support Austria to reach the 2040 climate neutrality, which is in the government's program anyway. And then there was a really big call for the organization and facilitation team, where I already was hired by the Ministry for Climate Action to kind of coordinate the whole process. This was one of my main first jobs, to write this call. And in this call, we left the remit, or let's say the topic or the research question, if you want, or the question for the assembly open. And then the facilitation team, together with some of us, we formed a core team of 12 people. There were people from the stakeholder board, from the public relation team, then from the moderators, from the secretary, from the ministry, and we together formulated. So the main question, which was based on was quite broad and based on this goal, to develop not measures but Empfehlungen, this is proposals for measures to reach climate neutrality in Austria. It needn't be 100% because we were sure we can't have a scientific evaluation in parallel to see quantitatively if it is reached, but the scientific board was also in part of it, in the core team did some evaluation on it. So it was a top-down issue, but in the first, our citizens met 6 weekends within half a year. The first weekend, the subtopics were presented. The subtopics were developed by the core team as well, given the main sectors in Austria emitting greenhouse gas emissions, and from literature all over Europe. So it was mobility, nutrition, and so on. We had 5 of them, and they could add topics or write subtopics within the given 5. And this enriched the whole, let's say, remit on a more detailed level, but the overall frame was given to them.
Cool, thank you. Very insightful. Then Andrea was wondering, so I guess you can, now we have like these 2 experiences, 2 different cases that we've heard about. And with your experience from the ministry, from the EU, do you have any reflections on this balance that you could have between having something that's more top-down steered, gathering people to set a remit that might be more relevant to the policy system, and then having like a more bottom-up approach where you let the process loose, so to say, you empower the citizens to a larger degree to set the remit. Do you have any reflections on that?
Well, I see that there are advantages and disadvantages in both cases. I have in particular a direct experience on an assembly that together with Stephanie, by the way, we have set up in Italy for in the region Emilia-Romagna for a sort of experimental case. In that case, we used a bottom-up approach for designing the remit because we in making publicity about the assembly and gathering people wishing to participate, because it was not made with selection, blind selection. It was depending on interest from people. We asked also people to propose the themes, and we selected, we put together maybe several teams, and we understood the interest of people, and we decided on specific groups of thematic discussions. Of course, this has an advantage of having of gathering the root interest of people, and people can participate with passion to the discussion and so on. On the other side, it is not said that this will produce anything useful for policymaking, and this may create frustration in participants. On the other side of a remit that is decided by policymakers within a frame of a political discussion on some subject, well, the risk is so for sure you can obtain results that find a possible application. On the other side, of course, the discussion is less free, is less left to the root interest of people, and therefore there may be some frustration on that side. So all participants should take into account that some degree of frustration is necessary to live with. And therefore, the phase of preparation, of learning phase, is extremely important. We are talking about, in particular in the climate domain, of very complex issues that cannot be solved by yes and no. And therefore, the training and the participation of experts in this phase is extremely important. And it's extremely important to have very good people that can explain the complexity of issues and make this complexity enter into everyone's knowledge. Otherwise, the risk is great of failure, basically.
Really interesting point, Andrea. And I'm thinking it's interesting with the frustration thing. So I guess that to some extent it's difficult to avoid frustration when you make any type of process with people. But I'm also wondering, I mean, I guess it also ties onto managing expectations, but also thinking about what is actually the role of the assembly, right? So I was wondering whether in your different cases, how did the consideration about the role of the assembly influence the choice of remit, and do you have a preference for, based on your experience, for what type of role a climate assembly should play? Anybody?
Yes, I wonder whether it's less about empowering citizens than empowering policymakers and politicians and so on who feel totally incapable of acting. So I just wonder whether we're looking the wrong way when we're looking at this process. So for example, when we established the question for the Scottish Climate Assembly, the civil servants had wanted, how should Scotland respond to the climate emergency, which is a big fluffy question that, and we then had a process, a kind of deliberative process where we brought in Kevin Anderson, giving a kind of very strong view of the science in terms of how drastic the situation is. We had a kind of a much more government-friendly scientists giving a kind of, it's okay, what's happening is all right, it's under control. We had somebody giving a very radical view of assemblies to say they could be transformative, and somebody else saying they're not, they're just a little thing that is useful. So we had the whole stewarding group, just politicians and business leaders and so on, then in small groups anonymously considering both of these perspectives and coming up with a very kind of radical perspective, as we would describe from a politically realist point of view. But from a kind of physics realist point of view, they came up with a very straightforward question that was really ambitious. So I guess for me, this is very much about how do we empower those who are supposed to have power, but clearly have no power over the situation? How do we reclaim the space for policymakers to actually attune themselves to the realities we're facing and move through in that way? So I think your business is about who's setting the remit, who's setting the agenda, and that needs to be very much civil society and government rather than just one or the other, and it wasn't in our case. How you set the question needs to be something that is deliberative in itself rather than a bunch of folk representing positions and arguing with each other. I'm Extinction Rebellion, your government, whatever, but people actually in a deliberative space where they feel safe to say the complexity that Andrea was referring to, because we all have a complexity. It's more the complexity inside us, though, than I'd say out there. I think out there it's quite straightforward. What needs to be done is quite straightforward. It's very, 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 very hard, but it's straightforward what needs to be done. And so there's something about the sequencing of the assembly being one which actually does consider the level of crisis we're in and arises its own decision. So it's not me telling, it's not somebody else, it's them hearing the spectrum and then listening to the kind of levels of response that currently exist and saying, is that sufficient? And deciding yes or no, and then deciding on the causes, what's actually driving this? And then, so I would suggest a level of ambition, which will of course fail and it will be frustrating and it won't work, but which allows us all to up our level of ambition, because this isn't a crisis that we can tinker around with and think in 100 years time, somebody will do something about it. And just now we're just playing. This is real, this is for real, and it's for now. So that level of ambition is absolutely critical because that's the level we're in.
Cool, thank you very much, Justin. Ines, Andrea, any reflections on this point?
I can. Was not the questions I was expecting, so I did write a lot, but I would answer in other questions, but it's very interesting. I think in our case, we had two layers of roles. The official role was really having a mini Austria presented here, randomly chosen by our Federal Statistical Office, according to 6 criteria, that they should develop proposals for policy measures, be it existing measures discussed in literature, because we had a scientific board advising them, not normative advice, but really knowledge, basic knowledge, so giving this proposal for measures that, on the one hand, maybe, and including even new, it was given measures and maybe new ones. So being creative and innovative, so that it maybe would be easier for policymakers to have a holistic set of measures needed to reach climate neutrality, and maybe even more to legitimize maybe unpopular political decisions. However, footnote, I'm not sure if the Austrian government or part of it wants to do this, footnote closed. Anyway, this is the official role. However, within the facilitation team, who are really very super professional, trained, about 30 to 40 facilitators and assistants in very innovative facilitation methods, including things as dynamic facilitation and so on. Their main aim was maybe really to empower, as you just said before, Justin, the people to go beyond their comfort zone, to stand up for their rights. Maybe they didn't, we had some of our citizens who said for them that the whole life changed totally. They didn't know about climate change at all, or only really little, and they are now a messenger in their area, in their community, even going to being a politician and so on. So it's empowering, not only during the Climate Assembly, to really get radical, if I may say so, but also afterwards. And this was the second aim, and this was really important for the facilitation team. And I think implicitly we had it in our call, because we asked for facilitators who are able to empower people to open these safe spaces where we can have dialogues and really show ourselves with all our emotions and fears and so on, and skepticism as well. So, but it was not the case. The official role of the assembly was did influence the remit, but the rest was more unofficially and growing throughout this half year, and this was had the same strengths. And by the way, we finished our assembly, and on next Monday, 10:30, our citizens will present the results to the public. So I must not tell you them, but I know them, of course, and there will be about 90 measures, and the whole set of these measures is really, of course, you can always be more radical or so, but really, really powerful. And this is, I think, because there are different roles than just giving a basis for policy making.
Cool, thank you very much. And yeah, time is flying, very good inputs. Just before I open for questions in the chat, I just want to bring in Stephanie and Janosch. Now we've heard some experiences from different cases, and I was just wondering, you told us that you've been talking to 40 plus people. If you had the chance to choose a remit, what would you choose? Or is that, if that's completely impossible to say, what would you focus on considering?
I think Janosch has an answer for this already.
I was just about to say, you go and answer, Stephanie. No, honestly, I mean, I'm thinking about that all the time. But it's so hard. There are so many different things to consider, and alone for that reason, I think it's a good idea to get many different people on board and to discuss with them, because I have no idea what's going on in different policy realms. For example, like in the political sphere, I don't know what the key conflicts are. Also, I'm not a climate scientist, so I mean, I know quite a bit about it, but I wouldn't consider myself an expert. So also, I wouldn't dare to say we must do this. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
On my side, I mean, to some extent, the Italian regional assemblies, like, they were quite rough and ready, due in part to the, well, we were trying to influence the use of the recovery fund money, which was a process that was coming down like a train with massive implications for, you know, for it's a do or die kind of a scenario. Like, you know, either we spend the money properly and we've invested in like, you know, Italy's transition and future, or we've just saddled generations with an incredible debt burden without actually realizing the potential of this money. So we, you know, the assembly process was a way of sort of demonstrating that you can get citizens involved and that they do have priority. You know, they're just modeling the process of democracy as well. So in a sense, you know, that's still my that would still be my passion, my preference, is to get citizens to express themselves very clearly on, you know, 360 degrees on how the recovery fund money should be used in Italy, because it is just such a massive amount of cash, and you know, it could very well just go to you know, inflate the bank accounts of already corrupt people, or it could be a real opportunity for transformation in the country.
If I may continue the thinking of.
Yeah, you muted yourself, Andrea.
I'm sorry, I'm forced. Anyway, continuing the discussion opened by Stephanie. I'm not so convinced that the 360 degrees option is the best. Because you can receive a lot of attention to very fancy questions, issues, which are not fancy at all from the viewpoint of what is the outcome. I make an example that may be not liked by many, but the example is planting trees. There is a wave of people who says that planting trees is the solution. And you remember maybe, Stephanie, that we had even those talking of planting billions of trees everywhere in order to solve the problem. Now, who is against that? Probably not many in an assembly which is not knowing what are the trade-offs of this. And trade-offs are complex, are really complex, but there is a basic trade-off, which is if you give attention to that, you don't give attention to the fact that is more important, which is to end with fossil fuels in order to obtain the result. And so this is basically what happened in some of the subgroups that we had and of course, what lead me to the point that the remit and the presentation of the problems have to arrive to show which are the trade-offs in the decision. If trade-offs are not clear, then we can have beautiful assemblies, but with no meaning. And but it's important. It's important to have trade-offs very, very clear on the table, and therefore at that point you can understand which are the conflict of interest that go in one direction or the other, and people who can take a position or a different one.
Can I just add to that, Andrea? I agree with you very much. I think what came out in the paper was the issue of sub-themes and when those themes happen. And unless you first consider the level of crisis and what the response is now and what's causing the crisis, then you end up with all sorts of sub-themes which assume the status quo and then do what they can do within that framework. So unless it's fine to break into sub-themes, as long as that's after the Assembly as a whole has considered what is the issue, what are we up against, what level of transformation is needed. It's up to them to decide all of that, but they need to be able to have a chance to decide that. In the Scottish one, they moved into sub-themes very quickly. And so people were then basically deciding in their theme area, assuming that everything else was staying the same. Well, if you do that, you end up with just reinforcing a set of policies which look good. They look, as you say, like tree planting. They look like they're nice things to do, but they don't address the fundamental issue, which is that transformation that's required. So just want to echo an agreement with you. The only thing I would say is that I don't think trade-offs are necessarily the level we're working on here. Trade-offs have to be in place when some people have power and resources and other people don't. Then you have to trade off between those, do the disabled get this, do the get whatever else. But if you're actually addressing the fundamental issue of power, then actually it's not trade-off thinking you need, it's actually meeting fundamental needs. And I'd suggest that we're moving into that territory around the climate. 10 years ago, it would have been trade-off thinking, but now it's much more, how do we ensure everybody's fundamental needs are met as we go through a really rocky 100, 200, 300 years or whatever ahead, because we've left it too late. So I think we're below trade-off thinking now, we're into actually need-meeting territory, and how do we ensure that as we move ahead?
Thank you, Justin. Really interesting discussion here. I just want to ask before we move on, maybe with this discussion or something else, Stine, if there are any questions in the chat that we should check out.
There are not really a direct question, but there are some reflections about the concept Volksbegehren, whether that is comparable in principle to the EU citizen initiative. So maybe you have some comments on that. And then there's also the question of, does the Climate Assembly have value if not if they're not inclusive, if not the aim is to be inclusive? So that's two reflections, yeah.
Thank you very much.
I do not want to spend too much time on this translation of a Volksbegehren. There is no real translation as it doesn't exist. Erwin Meyer says I did the wrong translation. The translation I took is from the website of the official website of the Klimarat. It's really a citizens initiative asking for people to sign a certain petition. I would call it referendum, but it's not this referendum that is binding then for anything, but out of it binding referenda can emerge. So this is maybe to this. And about inclusiveness, I think it depends really on the purpose of the assembly. For instance, in Austria, we have this instrument in two of our federal states that with 1,000 signatures of citizens, one, we call it Wisdom Council, Bürgerräte. So it's kind of a mini assembly for a weekend with a certain facilitation method. They can require such a mini assembly, and then it might be, depending on a topic, that the criteria to select the citizens that participate are broad and all over the federal state, or it's a certain group of people, especially maybe disabled people or people with a migration background and so on. So this is for me not to answer with the one and only answer, but if it's a national assembly on a topic such as climate change, I would see it, yes, it should be as inclusive as possible. That's my answer to this. And for the other discussion, I could also say something, but I don't want to talk too much as many did not talk yet, and I'm happy to hear more from the audience.
Fine, Ines. Thank you very much for the inputs. But as far as I understood, and Stine, there was most comments. So maybe if we could go back to the discussion we had before, because I think, Justin, you were just about to say something about moving into subgroups within an assembly. So as Stephanie and Janosch presented, you could have this overall remit for a process, but then maybe it's so broad a remit that you need to or you have so many people involved in the assembly that it's sort of required that you need to break it down in some way. I was wondering what type of reflections you have on that in terms of credibility, legitimacy, how to ensure that.
Yes, I mean, so in terms of your paper, it seemed to me it was about who sets the agenda. You know, what is the agenda? What's the question? And then how do you tackle that? And I was suggesting a kind of, what we learned was there were these three things that need to be tackled first before you move into any sub-theme. So there needs to be, what's the crisis? How's it being dealt with now? What are the causes of it? And then the sub-themes, I think, can work. I've just come back from helping run assemblies in Tanzania and in Kenya, people's assemblies there, not citizen assemblies, as in not sortition, but and I think sub-themes can work strongly. And in fact, they can work even better when they're tackling the same issue. So in other words, you're not breaking into themes, you're breaking into small groups so you can have genuine conversations and difficulties. And what's amazing is the things that get said in those small groups are so much more interesting than what gets reported back to the main circle. I find that, if anyone can answer this for me, I'd be really glad to know why. Why what's said? I think it's because what's said is quite intimate and quite personal and quite passionate. And when the person's reporting back, they're kind of being protective of those in the small group. So they're kind of boring, what they bring back to the middle. So there's having some way of actually ensuring that, you know, what's really being developed, the imagination and the understanding that's been developed by citizens in those smaller groups can really be captured and move forward, I think is really vital, that we don't think of the higher level. As people move up, they tend to get more boring, they tend to go for a more bland approach. Whereas when it's much more grounded, it can be quite inspirational and quite stunning. So it's less about breaking into sub-themes, I'd suggest, though you can do that if you've agreed on the basic frame of what needs to be transformed, what level you're pitching it at. And that should be up to the citizens, not the rest of us. But if they've decided on that, then they could look at transport, they could look at health, they could look at all of those areas in a way that's aware that everything else can shift. So it would be kind of like, assuming everything else has changed, how would we change this? Rather than assuming everything else has stayed in place, which little bit can we change here? But I would suggest rather than sub-themes, it's actually just subgroups, so people can be in safe enough groups to be able to really go deeply into their experience and draw that into the process. And of course, the key is the evidence, that they hear a real good range of evidence. That's obviously fundamental. So who sets the evidence? Who decides what evidence is being heard? And that they can be, and that's why I think the balance between civil society and government is really crucial. So they hear the range. Government will think, they'll believe us. Extinction Rebellion will think, they'll believe us, doesn't matter. It's just that you have the range there, and then citizens can have the sense, in my experience, to actually make up their minds, and they may well go for somewhere completely different.
Thank you, Justin. And anybody else, reflections on moving into subgroups or sub-themes?
I think that Justin has touched a very important point. So if you have an assembly, you have to give everyone the correct place to express himself or herself and be satisfied of the process. And this the running in small groups where people can talk better, are more free to say, it's extremely important. On the other hand, I see that this process, of course, have many, there are variants there, because you can have also rolling groups. They are not the same, and they change in part of the participants in order to know better other people. So to have, and there is a lot of creativity there. The role of experts is, in my opinion, extremely important, because sometimes discussions go out of track that can be productive. And you need experts that may, at different stages, enter into the discussion and propose issues that have to be considered by everyone in order to continue.
Thank you, Andrea. And you were nodding, Ines.
I absolutely agree what Andrea said with the experts. So in our case, scientific parties was extremely well, and we had really good luck with our 15 experts who were not only setting the stage for the different topics, but also, although not planned in the beginning, they were so excited themselves about having such a diversity or diverse audience, and being on the same level with the citizens, that they came nearly every weekend as background resource persons, and when needed, going into the different groups. We worked a lot in groups, because you can't work with 100 people in a plenary too much. And we had always 2 groups on the same topic, but they defined the themes in the topic themselves. So they were different, for instance, in energy or in mobility or in housing. And this scientific board was here really as resource persons, and in the end, also our citizens said they never knew that scientists can be so normal people and having also fun and smiling and crying and showing themselves. And this is, of course, was only possible in the later weekends, not in the earlier ones. So I agree with you, Andrea, that this is important. And not steer the discussion, but kind of come in and regulate from time to time, especially if they hang in a topic that is absolutely not relevant. For instance, in our case, it was plastic waste. It's not irrelevant, but was not so much relevant for our climate neutrality. And what Justin said, I mean, having groups discuss their own topics, whatever comes up, like in a more self-organizing way was in our case not possible because it was really quite structured. But I could imagine that such groups can, within a structured assembly, have place as kind of, we once had an open space in the very end, where the citizens could bring in their topics for reaching out. This was not within the measures proposed, but reaching out. And this was super interesting because we had 12 or 13 citizens just having ideas they brought up. And I like these elements in between. And so I agree with you, Justin, we could have maybe been more courageous in doing this. But this was also a lack of time why we didn't do it. Yeah, so.
Cool. Thank you very much, Ines. And then maybe just to round off here, that you're picking up on the importance of evidence and experts. You mentioned, Stephanie, in the presentation that in the Danish case, there were two phases. And in the first one, it was more like a top-down provision of evidence to people, and then they sort of had to react on that. And in the other phase, there was more like a bottom-up approach where people discussed what they wanted to discuss. So they discussed the remit before they got the expert input. So I was wondering whether you have any reflections on the role of experts here, both in designing the remit, but also when starting the assembly.
Thanks. No, I mean, I think I would echo Justin in the sense that it's much easier for citizens or for participants to orient themselves when they do have sort of the panoply of information before them first. And I think that's, there's a lot that can happen in the, information sharing and sort of wisdom sharing part, where it's also, I think there's a lot about sort of, trust building and interactions and, sort of vision setting together, which can set a very good groundwork for the future deliberations. So I think there are a lot of good reasons to go through that sort of, information download and exchange and interaction at the beginning. And I think, the more, and, possibly go into this a bit more in the future, but, I think the more that the dynamic is set, that, it's the participants seeking out the additional information that they need and trusting them to be able to balance the different interests. I mean, this is the same thing that our politicians do too usually, but it's just that they're ordinarily hearing much more decisively from one side that already has the pre-written legislation. But I think everybody needs to go through the the process of listening and deliberation, and then it becomes much clearer, what the sort of the bones of the crisis really look like, and then from there, where it behooves us to focus the most of our energy.
Thank you. And just maybe a quick follow-up question. So whether you have any considerations about whether these initial expert inputs to which extent they determine the trajectory that the citizens would go down.
Actually, maybe I'll leave that one to Janosch. I know he's passionate about that question.
Yeah. Sorry, Frederick, I was just writing a message to you, so I didn't hear what the question was, actually, to be honest. If you could repeat that.
Your considerations about the degree to which expert input upfront in a assembly process determines what people think or what they're going to discuss. I mean, so
yeah. I mean, of course, I don't know. I mean, there's some evidence from scientific studies that actually the information provision at the very beginning does quite a lot to assembly members and assembly participants, and that's also broadly, how the problem is framed. Justin was also mentioning that. So I think we just need to be aware that this has quite an impact on the assembly and be clear about that. So it's important that this is done in a legitimate way. And yeah, one way to do that is to have an open process, a transparent process, a deliberative process about it. Yeah, and I think there's much more work to be done there.
Sure. So let's be that the round off of this session. I can see that Janosch, you would love to have some bigger picture closing remarks. I think we should jump to that then.
Okay, I think Andrea had his hand up though.
Okay.
I just wanted to add one point, that this phase of expert presentation of a problem and so on is very important, but it is more important for the process, because it should show that every decision needs a study, needs understanding, needs data, and it's not gut feeling that has to be applied, but it is a process of and it is understanding the variety of and the complexity of the issue. So this is it's a formative part of the assembly that is extremely important.
Definitely. Thank you very much for that input, Andrea. And then Janosch.
Yes, I think it was super interesting to hear all your different perspectives. I just wanted to, at the end, broaden the picture a bit again. I think the things that I want to say to the end is, first of all, citizens' assemblies or climate assemblies will not solve the climate crisis. I think we need to have that in mind. I think they can really contribute and can augment our electoral systems where they have issues in dealing with this, but they will not solve it. I think that's important to keep in mind. The second is, I think we should really embrace the complexity here, and that context is different in every case all the time. And there's really, in each case, we kind of need to find a balance of addressing things that are currently not talked about, but also at the same time, keeping in mind that in the end, we want to have these assemblies to have impact. So there's, on both ends of the extreme, there's no value. If we talk about stuff and come up with mundane stuff that politicians would have implemented anyways, where's the value in spending so much money and time and effort in citizens' assemblies? On the other hand, if we talk about really transformative stuff and come up with really transformative recommendations, but in the end, no one takes it up, then again, where's the value? But I would be super hesitant in saying this is the one way citizens or climate assemblies should be held, because it always depends on so many factors in each case, so many design factors. It depends on where is the climate policy debate, what is the narrative, how are policymakers also, what is their attitudes, how receptive are they, and so on and so forth. And I think what we try to do with our outputs is to nonetheless kind of provide some guidance and helping you to fill out these context variables by yourself and do the thinking by yourself.
Cool. Thank you very much for those final remarks, Janosch. Some food for thought, and thank you very much, Janosch, Stephanie, for the hard work, and thank you, Justin and Ines and Andrea, for showing up and participating in discussion. And just before we leave the session, I think Mark will like to round it off.
I would love to. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been really interesting to listen, and especially to you, Stephanie and Janosch, for the hard work, and to you, Ines, Andrea, and Justin, for taking time to join us. So thank you, and see you very soon.